Tonight's story is not about something big, not about something loud or urgent. It's about a small town where nothing seems to happen, and yet everything gently does. A place where time slows down, where people notice things they usually forget, and where even the quietest moments have meaning. So if your mind has been busy today, if your thoughts won't quite settle, let this story carry you somewhere softer, somewhere slower, somewhere you don't have to think. You only have to listen. Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin. A story by itself is just air. It drifts and fades unless someone is there to hold it, to listen, to give it a quiet place to land. So I am glad you are here. Wherever you are tonight, maybe the room is dim. Maybe the world outside has finally gone still. Or maybe it has not, and that is why you are here. Either way, let us begin gently. It was one of those early mornings in Milford Junction when the light came slowly. Not in a rush, but in a kind of careful way, as if it did not want to disturb anything that might still be resting. The sky had that pale color that sits somewhere between night and day, and the air carried the soft dampness of a night that had not fully let go. If you had stepped outside just then, you might have noticed how the town seemed to pause, not stop completely, but pause in the way a breath lingers before being released. The streets were quiet, though not empty. There was always something, a small sound, a distant movement, something to remind you that the world was still turning. Just at its own pace, the first sign of the day came, as it often did, from the bakery on Main Street. Not the bell above the door, not yet, but the faint warm glow from inside, and the soft suggestion of rising dough, a smell that drifted out into the cool air and settled along the sidewalk like something familiar, something dependable. Across the street, the old post office stood in its usual place, brick walls holding on to the night's chill, and beside it, the bench with the worn green paint waited patiently, as it always did. It was not a remarkable bench, not really, but it had a way of belonging, as if it had been placed there not by decision, but by time itself. Now, if you listened closely, you might have heard the distant hum of a train far beyond the edge of town. Not loud enough to interrupt, just enough to remind you that something was moving with purpose, though Milford Junction had never been in much of a hurry to follow. It was on this particular morning that something slightly unusual began to take shape, not all at once, not in a way that would catch immediate attention, but slowly, the way most things in Milford Junction tend to arrive. It started with Mr. Harlan. He was a man of routines, the kind that did not change much from one day to the next. He woke early, always before the sun had properly decided to rise. He made his coffee the same way each morning, measuring carefully, stirring slowly, and then he stepped out onto his porch with his cup, not to do anything in particular, but simply to begin the day. On this morning, though, something held him there a little longer than usual. Not anything dramatic, just a feeling, the kind that is hard to explain and easy to ignore. Except he did not ignore it. He stood there, coffee in hand, looking out toward the quiet street, and after a moment, he tilted his head slightly, as if listening for something that had not quite arrived yet. Across the way, Mrs. Dorsey was just opening her kitchen window. She did this every morning, no matter the weather. She said it helped the house wake up, though no one had ever asked the house how it felt about that. She paused too, her hand resting on the window frame, noticing the same thing, though she would not have called it anything more than a quiet morning. And perhaps that is all it was. But in Milford Junction, even a quiet morning has a way of carrying something with it. A small shift, a gentle change, something that settles into the day before anyone quite realizes it is there. The birds, for instance, were slower to begin. Not silent, just unhurried. Their usual chatter softened into something more spaced out, as if they too were taking their time. The air felt a little thicker, though not heavy, more like it was holding on to something, waiting, perhaps. By the time the sun began to show itself properly, rising just enough to touch the tops of the buildings along Main Street, a few more people had stepped into their routines. Mr. Lyle at the hardware store unlocked his door with the same careful motion he had used for years. He paused before stepping inside, glancing up at the sky, not because he expected anything unusual, but because it was something he had always done. And this morning, he lingered just a second longer. At the edge of town, near the old depot that no longer saw much use, the clock mounted above its entrance remained still. Not obviously at first. It had been slow before. Everyone knew that. But now it seemed to have stopped entirely, its hands resting quietly, as if they had simply decided they had gone far enough. No one noticed right away. That is the thing about Milford Junction. Changes do not arrive with noise or urgency. They settle in quietly, becoming part of the background before anyone thinks to question them. Back on Main Street, the bakery door finally opened. The bell above it gave its familiar soft ring, and the first customer stepped inside, bringing with them the faint chill of the morning air. The day had begun, but not quite in the way it usually did. There was something in the rhythm, a slight delay, a gentle shift, as if time itself had taken a step back and decided not to rush forward just yet. Mr. Harlan finished his coffee more slowly than usual. Mrs. Dorsey stood a moment longer at her window, and the town, without quite realizing it, began to move at a different pace, not faster, not slower exactly, just differently. And that was how it started. On a morning that felt almost the same as any other, except for the small, quiet sense that something had changed. Not enough to worry anyone, not enough to stop anything from happening, just enough to be noticed. If you were paying attention, and in Milford Junction, there were always a few who were. By the time the morning had properly unfolded, Milford Junction had settled into what most folks would have called a normal day, though if you paid close enough attention, there was still that faint sense of something being just a little out of step, not wrong, not troubling, just softer around the edges, the kind of difference you might notice in the way a clock ticks a fraction slower, or the way a familiar road feels slightly longer when you are in no hurry to reach the end of it. At the old depot, the clock remained still, its hands resting quietly at 23 minutes past 7. And though a few people passed by it that morning, none of them gave it more than a passing glance. It had been unreliable for years, sometimes running slow, sometimes a little ahead, and more than once. It had stopped altogether, only to start again without explanation. So its silence did not raise any alarms. Still, there was something about it that felt different this time. Not in the stopping itself, but in the way it seemed. Content, as if it had simply chosen to pause. Mr. Leland was the first to linger long enough to notice. He had come by with his usual steady walk, hands in his coat pockets, on his way to nowhere in particular, which was often how his mornings went. He stood at the edge of the depot lawn, looking up at the clock, tilting his head slightly. "Well now," he said softly to no one at all. "That's a new kind of quiet." He did not rush to fix it, did not call anyone, did not even check his own watch to compare. He simply stood there a moment, longer than usual, then gave a small nod, as if the clock had told him something worth hearing, and continued on his way. Back in town, the day moved gently forward, though not quite in the usual rhythm. At the bakery, Mrs. Jensen noticed that the dough was rising a little slower than expected. She pressed her fingers lightly against it, waiting for that familiar spring. But it took its time returning. "Well," she murmured, wiping her hands on her apron, "no need to rush it." And she left it as it was. At the hardware store, Mr. Lyle found himself rearranging a shelf of nails that had not needed rearranging. Not because anything was wrong, but because the morning felt like it had room for such things. He worked quietly, moving one box, then another, taking a little more care than usual, as if the act itself mattered more than the result. Outside, the sun climbed higher, though even that seemed unhurried, its light spreading slowly across the rooftops and sidewalks, settling into the corners of the town without any urgency. The usual sounds were there, a lawnmower starting somewhere in the distance, the soft roll of bicycle tires along the pavement, the occasional bark of a dog who had spotted something worth announcing. But each sound seemed to arrive with a little more space around it, as if the day itself had stretched out around mid-morning. Mrs. Dorsey made her way toward the post office, carrying a small bundle of letters she had meant to send the day before, but had not gotten around to. She walked at her usual pace, though even she might have admitted, if asked, that she did not feel any particular need to hurry. As she passed the bench outside, she paused, not because she was tired, but because it seemed like the sort of morning that allowed for pausing. She sat down, setting the letters beside her, and looked out toward Main Street. A few cars passed. A man waved from across the street. The bakery bell rang softly as someone stepped inside. Everything was as it should be, and yet there was that same quiet difference, that gentle shift in the way the day moved. She found herself watching the light more than anything else, the way it fell across the pavement, the way it caught on the edges of windows and signs. After a while, she picked up her letters again. But instead of heading straight to the post office, she turned slightly, walking a slower path, as if the destination was not quite as important as the walking itself. Meanwhile, over at the library, Miss Clara had opened the doors earlier than usual. Though she could not quite say why, the building was cool and quiet. The shelves lined with books that seemed to hold their own kind of stillness. She moved through the space with soft footsteps, adjusting a chair here, straightening a stack of books there. At the front desk, she glanced up at the wall clock, which was, as always, a little behind. But today, even that seemed to matter less. She set her things down, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat for a moment without opening a single book, just listening. It was not silence exactly. There were always sounds, small ones, distant ones, the faint creak of the building, the turning of a page somewhere deep in the stacks. But there was space between them, a kind of calm that settled into the room and stayed there. By noon, the town had fully awakened. Though it had not rushed to do so, the usual patterns were in place. People moving through their routines, conversations starting and ending, doors opening and closing, and yet, beneath it all, there remained that same gentle difference. At the depot, the clock still had not moved, its hands resting where they had been since morning. A few more people noticed now, pointing it out with mild curiosity, sharing a quiet remark or two, but no one seemed particularly concerned. "It'll start again," someone said. "They always do," and that seemed to be enough. Because in Milford Junction, things had a way of finding their own time. And perhaps that was what the day was offering. Not a problem to solve, but a reminder that not everything needed fixing right away. That sometimes a pause was just a pause. And sometimes that was exactly what was needed. By early afternoon, the light over Milford Junction had settled into that soft, steady glow that comes when the sun is high but not demanding. The kind of light that does not rush shadows along, but lets them stretch slowly, as if they too had nowhere particular to be. The town moved within that light, gently, almost thoughtfully. At the diner on the corner of Main and Willow, the lunch crowd had come and gone in a quieter way than usual. There had been no real lull, no empty moment, just a steady, unhurried flow of people who seemed content to sit a little longer than they needed to. Mrs. Callahan stood behind the counter, refilling coffee cups that did not seem to empty as quickly as they normally would. She noticed it in the way she always noticed things, without fuss, without drawing attention. "Well now," she said softly as she wiped the counter. "Seems like folks have found a bit of extra time today." No one answered directly, but a few nodded, the kind of quiet agreement that does not need to be spoken aloud. At a table near the window, Mr. Dorsey had unfolded his newspaper, though he had been on the same page for quite some time, reading, perhaps, or simply letting his eyes rest on the words without feeling the need to move on. Outside, the street held that same gentle stillness. Cars passed now and then. A bicycle rolled by with the soft rhythm of turning wheels. And the wind, if it could be called that, barely moved at all, Over at the hardware store, Mr. Lyle had stepped outside, not for any particular reason, just to stand a while in the doorway. He leaned one shoulder against the frame, looking out at the street, watching the way the afternoon unfolded without urgency. A young boy passed by with a paper bag tucked under his arm, walking more slowly than children usually do, kicking lightly at the edge of the sidewalk. Mr. Lyle watched him go, then glanced up toward the sky, which had taken on that pale, endless blue that makes it hard to tell where 1 hour ends and another begins. Across town, the library had filled with that quiet kind of presence that comes when people gather without needing to speak. A few readers sat at the long wooden table, pages turning now and then, but without the usual quick rhythm. Miss Clara moved softly between the shelves, returning books that did not seem in any hurry to find their places. She paused near the window, looking out at the street. There was nothing unusual there, nothing that would catch the eye in any particular way. And yet, she stayed there a moment longer than she intended, not watching for anything, just watching. The clock above the desk ticked steadily, though it still lagged behind, as it always had, and for once, no one seemed to mind. At the edge of town, near the depot, a small group had gathered again, not out of concern, but out of quiet curiosity. The clock still had not moved. Mr. Leland stood there once more, hands in his pockets, joined now by Mrs. Wren and Mr. Tully, who had come by on their usual afternoon walk. They looked up together, 3 pairs of eyes resting on the still hands. "Well," Mrs. Wren said after a moment, "I suppose it's taking the day off." Mr. Tully gave a small chuckle. "Can't say I blame it." There was no urgency in their voices, no sense that anything needed to be done right away. Instead, they stood there for a while, letting the quiet settle around them. A breeze moved through then, soft enough to barely stir the grass, but enough to shift the air just slightly, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire town had taken a deeper breath. Back on Main Street, the bakery door opened and closed with its usual soft bell, but even that sound seemed to linger a little longer. As if it had more space to travel, Mrs. Jensen stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, looking up and down the street. She was not looking for anything in particular, just noticing the afternoon had that feeling now, the kind that does not ask anything of you, does not push or pull. It simply allows you to be where you are. By mid-afternoon, the shadows had begun to stretch just a little, though not in any hurry to lengthen fully. The town continued on. Tasks were done. Conversations drifted. Doors opened and closed, and through it all, that same quiet difference remained, not growing, not fading, just present at the bench outside the post office. Mrs. Dorsey had returned, this time without her letters, which had eventually been mailed, though not with any sense of urgency. She sat again, hands folded in her lap, looking out at the street. A man she did not know nodded as he passed. She nodded back. Neither of them stopped. Neither of them needed to. There was something about the day that made small acknowledgments feel complete on their own. After a while, She glanced toward the direction of the depot. Though she could not see the clock from where she sat, still she thought of it, resting there, unmoving, and for a brief moment. She wondered what it might feel like to simply stop, not out of necessity. Not because something had gone wrong, but because there was no need to move forward just yet. The thought passed as gently as it had come, and she returned her gaze to the street. The afternoon carried on, and in Milford Junction, no one hurried it along. By the time evening began to settle over Milford Junction, it did so in the same quiet, unhurried way the rest of the day had unfolded. There was no sudden shift, no clear moment when afternoon ended and evening began, just a gradual softening of the light. The sun lowered itself behind the grain elevator, casting long, gentle shadows that stretched across the sidewalks and lawns. Not sharply, but with a kind of ease, the air cooled slightly, though it still carried the warmth of the day, and with it came the familiar scent of lilac and cut grass, a scent that seemed to linger longer than usual. On Main Street, the bakery prepared to close. The last few customers stepped out with paper bags tucked under their arms, and the bell above the door gave its soft, final ring of the day. Mrs. Jensen paused before locking up, her hand resting on the handle, looking out across the street. There was nothing unusual to see, and yet she remained there a moment longer than she needed to, as if the evening itself had asked her not to rush away just yet. Across the way, the hardware store lights flickered on, casting a warm glow through the windows. Mr. Lyle moved inside, closing the register with his usual careful motion. He stepped outside for a moment, locking the door behind him, then stood there, keys in hand. He glanced up at the sky, now turning a soft blend of pink and fading blue, and took a slow breath. "Well," he said quietly to himself, "no harm in letting a day finish at its own pace." He slipped the keys into his pocket and began his walk home, though even that seemed slower than usual. At the edge of town, the depot stood in the quiet of early evening, its windows reflecting the last light of the day. The clock above it remained still, unchanged since morning, but now with a fading light around it, it seemed less like something that had stopped, and more like something that was simply resting. A few people passed by, glancing up as they had throughout the day. Mr. Leland returned once more, not out of concern, but out of habit. He stood where he had stood before, hands in his pockets, looking up at the clock. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, almost as if speaking to an old friend, "You've had a long run," he murmured. "No need to rush on my account." The breeze moved gently through the trees nearby, and the leaves answered with a soft rustle. It was the kind of sound that filled the quiet without breaking it. Back in town, lights began to appear in windows, one by one, soft and warm against the deepening blue of the evening. The church bell rang out the hour, not sharply, but with a steady, measured tone that seemed to settle over the town. Each note carried a little farther than usual, lingering in the air before fading. At the post office bench, Mrs. Dorsey sat once more, though now she held a light sweater around her shoulders. She watched as the streetlights flickered on, their glow pooling gently on the pavement. A few people passed by, offering quiet greetings. Small nods, soft smiles, the kind of exchanges that required no effort. She found herself thinking again of the day, of the way it had moved, or perhaps the way it had not rushed, and without quite realizing it, she let out a slow breath she had not known she was holding. There was something comforting in it, in a way nothing had demanded attention. Nothing had needed fixing, even the still clock, which by now everyone knew about, had not become a problem. It had simply become part of the day over at the diner. A few late customers lingered over coffee, their voices low, their laughter soft. Mrs. Callahan moved between tables, refilling cups that no one seemed in a hurry to finish. "You'd think folks had nowhere else to be," she said with a small smile. "And maybe," one of the regulars replied, "today they don't." Outside, the sky deepened further. The last light slipping away behind the rooftops, stars began to appear, faint at first, then clearer as the darkness settled in. The town quieted, not completely. There were still sounds, a door closing somewhere, the distant hum of a car passing through, but they came gently, without urgency, at the depot. The clock stood silent beneath the night sky, its hands unchanged, and yet it no longer felt like something that needed to move. It simply belonged there, as it was. Mr. Leland turned to leave, giving one last glance upward. "Tomorrow's another day," he said softly, though he did not say it in the usual way. Not as something that needed to arrive, but as something that would. In its own time, he walked home slowly, the sound of his footsteps soft against the quiet street. And as Milford Junction settled into night, there was a sense, subtle but certain, that the day had not ended so much as eased into rest, and for once, no one seemed to be waiting for it to begin again. Sometime in the quiet stretch between night and morning, Milford Junction rested in a way it had not in a long while, not deeply, not heavily, but gently, as if the town itself had decided to sleep just a little longer than usual. The sky began to lighten, though slowly, a pale gray at first, then something softer, something that hinted at morning without fully committing to it. The birds stirred, but their songs came later than expected. Not absent, just delayed, as if even they had decided there was no need to rush into the day. On Sycamore Lane, Mr. Harlan woke at his usual hour, though for a moment, lying there in the quiet of his room, he had the faintest feeling that something was different. He sat up, listening. There was no clear sound to point to, no missing noise, no sudden interruption, and yet the morning felt unfinished. He rose anyway, following his routine with the same careful steps. Coffee measured, water poured, spoon stirring slowly against the cup. But even here, the rhythm felt softer, as if each action carried a little more space around it. He stepped onto his porch with his coffee, as he always did, and paused. The street before him was still, more still than usual, not empty, just Waiting across the way, Mrs. Dorsey had not yet opened her window, which was unusual. He glanced toward the sky, then back to the street. "Well now," he murmured quietly, "no need to hurry, I suppose," and he leaned lightly against the porch rail, taking his time with that first sip of coffee. On Main Street, the bakery lights came on, though a little later than they normally would inside. Mrs. Jensen moved through her morning tasks, but without the usual sense of timing. She paused more often, not out of forgetfulness, but as if the steps themselves had loosened. The dough rested longer than it needed to. The oven warmed more slowly. And for once, she did not mind. At the hardware store, Mr. Lyle unlocked the door with a quiet click, then stood there, hand still on the handle. He looked down the street, noticing the absence of the usual early movement. No rush of footsteps, no quick greetings, just the stillness. He stepped inside, leaving the door open a moment longer than usual, letting the morning air drift in. At the depot, the clock remained unchanged, its hands still resting where they had been since the day before. But now, in the soft light of morning, it seemed less like something that had stopped, and more like something that had simply not yet begun again. A small group gathered there once more. Not many, just a few who had come out early. Mr. Leland, as expected, and Mrs. Wren, wrapped in a light shawl, Mr. Tully beside her, hands folded behind his back. They stood quietly, looking up. "Well," Mrs. Wren said softly, "seems it's still taking its time." Mr. Tully nodded. "Can't say I blame it. No one suggested fixing it. Not yet." There was no urgency in the air, no sense that anything had gone wrong, only that something had. Paused back in town, the first signs of movement began. A car starting, a door opening, a voice calling out somewhere down the street. But even these came gently, without the usual push of morning. At the post office, the bench sat empty, though it would not remain that way for long. Mrs. Dorsey arrived shortly after. A little later than her usual time, she seemed aware of it, but not concerned. She sat down, as she had the day before, folding her hands in her lap. The street before her looked the same, and yet it felt different. The morning had not fully taken hold. It hovered, lingering, as if unsure whether to begin in earnest. A young man passed by, glancing at his watch, then slowing his steps as if realizing there was no real need to hurry after all. At the diner, Mrs. Callahan poured the first cups of coffee. Though the usual early crowd had not yet arrived, she stood behind the counter, looking out through the window. "Well," she said quietly, "seems like the morning's running a little late." No one answered, but the thought settled into the room just the same. The church bell rang the hour, though even that seemed softer, less insistent. Its sound drifted out across the town, lingering in the air before fading. At the library, Miss Clara unlocked the door and stepped inside, setting her things down with the same quiet care. She glanced at the clock above the desk, still slow, still behind, but now, that seemed almost fitting. She did not adjust it, did not reach to set it right. Instead, she let it be. The morning continued in this way, not fully beginning, not fully delayed, just stretching. And in Milford Junction, no one seemed particularly eager to pull it forward, because for the first time in a long while, there was nowhere they needed to be that could not wait a little longer. Asterisk, by mid-morning, Milford Junction had reached what should have been its busiest hour, the time when doors opened more often, voices carried a little farther, and the day usually found its pace. But today, that pace never quite arrived. The town moved. Yes, people stepped into their routines. Shops opened, coffee was poured, conversations began, and yet everything seemed to happen without urgency, as if the hour itself had stretched just enough to hold it all without rushing anything along. At the diner, the usual mid-morning crowd had gathered, though they did not fill the space in the same way they usually did. Some sat with their cups untouched for longer than usual. Others spoke in softer tones, their conversations drifting rather than landing. Mr. Dorsey was there again, newspaper folded neatly in front of him. Though he had not yet turned the page, "You'd think we'd be busier by now," he said after a while. Not with concern, but with quiet observation. Mrs. Callahan nodded as she wiped the counter. "Well, maybe we are," she replied, "just not in the usual way," and that seemed to be enough of an answer. Outside, the sunlight had strengthened, but it did not press down the way it sometimes did. It simply rested over the town. Shadows formed, but they moved slowly. So slowly that if you did not watch them carefully, you might not notice them moving at all. At the hardware store, Mr. Lyle stood behind the counter, watching the door more than he usually would. A customer came in, looked around, picked up a small box of nails, then paused. "You know," the man said, "I came in here for something else." Mr. Lyle gave a small smile. "Take your time," he said. "It'll come back to you." The man nodded, setting the nails down again, and instead of searching harder, he simply wandered the aisles, as if the need itself had softened across town. The library held its quiet presence, the usual low murmur of pages turning, chairs shifting, footsteps moving gently across the floor. Miss Clara sat at the desk, her hands folded loosely. She glanced at the clock above her. It still ticked, but slowly, deliberately. And for a moment, she found herself watching the second hand, waiting for it to move. When it did, it seemed almost thoughtful, not delayed, not broken, just unhurried. At the depot, the clock had not changed, its hands still resting in that same quiet position. But now, more people had noticed. A few stood nearby, not gathered in any formal way, just present. Mr. Leland was there again, as he had been each time. He leaned slightly on one foot, looking up. "Well," he said after a moment, "seems like it's not the only thing taking its time today." Mrs. Wren nodded. "And maybe that's all right," she said. There was a pause then. Not awkward, not uncertain, just a shared stillness. The kind that does not ask to be filled. Back on Main Street, the post office saw a steady trickle of visitors. But none of them stayed long, and none of them hurried out. They moved through their tasks with a kind of quiet ease. At the bench outside, Mrs. Dorsey sat once more. Watching the flow of the street, a man approached, then slowed as he neared, glancing briefly at his watch before slipping it back into his pocket. "Feels like there's more of the day than usual," he said. Half to himself, Mrs. Dorsey gave a small nod. "Yes," she said, "it does." They shared a brief smile, then went their separate ways. No more needed to be said. The church bell rang again, marking the hour. But even that felt different. The sound did not seem to push the day forward. It simply marked where it was, and the hour itself remained. It did not pass in the usual way, did not slip into the next moment. Instead, it seemed to hold, expanding just enough to carry everything within it. Conversations, quiet tasks, small thoughts that might have otherwise been missed. And in that space, something subtle began to settle over Milford Junction. Not confusion, not concern, but a kind of calm awareness that time, as it was being experienced that day, was not something to be chased, but something to be allowed at the diner. A man finished his coffee and stood to leave, then paused. He looked around the room at the familiar faces, the soft light, the quiet movement, then sat back down again. "Think I'll stay a little longer," he said. And no one found that unusual, because in Milford Junction, on this particular day, the hour did not move on. And for once, no one asked it to. By the time afternoon should have begun to lean toward evening, there was a quiet understanding moving through Milford Junction, not spoken, not announced, but felt. Something about the day had changed in a way that could no longer be ignored. And yet, no one seemed troubled by it. If anything, there was a kind of gentle acceptance. At the diner, the same customers remained, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because leaving no longer felt necessary. Cups were refilled, conversations drifted, and time, or whatever shape it had taken, seemed content to let them stay. Mr. Dorsey finally folded his newspaper, not because he had finished reading, but because he felt he had taken enough from it for now. "You ever notice," he said quietly, "how most days feel like they're slipping past you?" Mrs. Callahan nodded, still wiping the same spot on the counter, though it no longer needed it. "And today," he continued, "feels like it's waiting." She gave a small smile. "Well," she said, "maybe it is. Outside, the light had not changed as much as it should have. The sun still sat higher than expected, its warmth steady, its glow unchanged. Shadows stretched, but slowly, almost reluctantly, as if they were unsure whether they were meant to move at all. At the hardware store, Mr. Lyle had closed the register. Though it was not yet time to close, he stood near the doorway. Watching the street, a few people passed by, their steps unhurried, their movements softer. One of them paused, looking up at the sky. "Feels like we've been in this part of the day for a while now," he said. Mr. Lyle nodded. "Nothing wrong with that," he replied. And the man smiled, as if that was exactly the answer he had been hoping for. At the depot, more people had gathered now, not in a crowd, but in a quiet presence that filled the space without pressing on it. They stood in small groups or alone, looking up at the clock. Still unchanged, still resting. Mr. Leland was there, of course. As he had been throughout the day, he shifted his weight slightly, glancing at the others, then back at the clock. "Well," he said after a long moment, "seems like it's not just the clock." Mrs. Wren stood beside him, her hands folded neatly. "No," she said softly. "It's the whole day." A breeze moved through the trees then, soft enough to barely stir the leaves, and for a moment, it felt as though the town itself had exhaled. Back on Main Street, the post office bench was no longer empty. Mrs. Dorsey sat there again, though she was not alone this time. A young woman sat beside her, hands resting loosely in her lap. They did not speak for a while, just watched the street together. After some time, the young woman said, "I was supposed to be somewhere by now." Mrs. Dorsey turned slightly. "And are you worried about that?" she asked gently. The young woman thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No," she said, "not today." And that was all. At the library, Miss Clara had stopped arranging books altogether. Instead, she sat near the window, a book open in her lap. Though she had not turned a page in quite some time, the clock above the desk ticked slowly. Each second arriving without hurry, she listened to it. Not counting, not measuring, just listening. There was something comforting in that sound, in its steadiness. Even if it no longer marked the day in the usual way. The church bell rang again, but its sound felt softer now. Less like a signal, more like a presence. The town continued on, but not toward anything. Not toward evening, not toward night, just within itself. At the diner, someone laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that seemed to linger in the air. At the hardware store, a man left without buying anything, but with no sense that he had wasted his time. At the depot, the group remained, not waiting, not expecting, just there, and as the light held steady, refusing to fade in the usual way, a thought began to settle quietly into the town. Not spoken aloud, but shared all the same. What if the day did not move on? What if it stayed just like this? Soft, unhurried, complete for a moment. That idea did not feel strange. It felt possible, and more than that, it felt peaceful. Mr. Leland looked up at the clock once more, then let out a slow breath. "Well," he said quietly, "if it stays, it stays." No one disagreed, because in Milford Junction, on this day that had almost stopped, there was no reason to rush it forward. And for the first time in a long while, no one was waiting for what came next. There is a quiet moment that comes sometimes, not at the beginning of a day, and not quite at the end. A moment that feels like the world pausing to decide something, as if even time itself needs a breath. That was the moment Milford Junction found itself in. The light still hung gently over the town. Unchanged, unhurried, the air held its softness, and every sound seemed to arrive with care. But beneath it all, There was something else now, a subtle shift, like the feeling you get just before a memory returns, not sudden, not sharp, just approaching. At the depot, the small gathering had grown quieter, not because there was nothing to say, but because words no longer felt necessary. Mr. Leland rested his hand lightly against the railing, his eyes still on the clock. For the first time that day, he tilted his head slightly. "You hear that?" he asked. Mrs. Wren listened. The others did too. At first, there was nothing different. The same soft breeze, the distant hum of town life. And then, faintly, a tick, so small it might have been imagined. But it came again, and again, not steady yet, not certain, but present, the clock. Not fully awake, but remembering. No one moved closer. No one spoke louder. They simply stood, letting the moment unfold. At the library, Miss Clara looked up from her chair, her gaze drifting toward the clock above the desk. It had not changed, not visibly, and yet something in the room felt different. The silence had shifted, not broken, just lighter. She placed her book gently on the table beside her, as if preparing for something, though she did not know what. Across town at the diner, Mrs. Callahan paused mid-step. The cloth still in her hand, she listened, the faintest awareness touching her expression. "Did you feel that?" she asked. Mr. Dorsey looked up, not confused, just thoughtful. "Maybe," he said. He tapped the side of his cup lightly, as if testing something unseen. Outside, a cloud drifted slowly across the sun, and for the first time all day, the light changed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to be noticed. Shadows deepened just a little, stretching with a purpose they had not held before. The breeze carried a different note, cooler, more certain. At the post office bench, Mrs. Dorsey and the young woman both looked up at the same moment. Neither spoke, but both felt it. "That's new," the young woman said softly. Mrs. Dorsey nodded. "Yes," she replied. "It is at the hardware store." Mr. Lyle stepped outside, looking up at the sky. "Well now," he murmured, "looks like the day's remembering what it was meant to do." Back at the depot, the ticking grew clearer, still slow, still uneven, but steady enough to be real. Mr. Leland let out a quiet breath. "Thought it might," he said. Mrs. Wren smiled, though her eyes remained on the clock. "It just needed time," she said. There was something gently amusing about that, though no one laughed, because it felt true. The clock was not restarting all at once. It was easing back, as if it too had needed a moment to rest, to pause, to remember. And as it did, the town followed, not rushing, not catching up, but continuing. The diner began to empty slowly, not because people were in a hurry, but because now they knew where they were going. The library door opened and closed again, footsteps returning to their usual rhythm. The hardware store light flickered on, just a little earlier than expected, and at the post office, the bench was empty once more, but not forgotten. Nothing from that day would be forgotten. At the depot, The group began to drift apart. No announcements, no conclusions, just quiet departures. Each person carrying something with them, something small but certain. Mr. Leland remained a moment longer, his eyes still on the clock. Now ticking, now moving, minute by minute. As it always had, he nodded once. "Good," he said softly, then turned and made his way down the steps. The sun dipped lower now, this time for real. The sky beginning to shift into softer colors, pinks and golds. The kind that only come when a day has truly decided to end. And Milford Junction, gently, quietly, moved with it. Not rushed, not pulled, just carried as evening approached. There was a feeling in the air, not of something lost, but of something given. A day that had paused, and in doing so, had reminded everyone what it meant to notice, to sit, to stay, to be. And as the first porch lights flickered on, and the soft hum of night began to settle in, there was one thought, shared, unspoken, but understood by all. Some days are not meant to pass quickly. Some days are meant to stay with you even after they are gone. There is a certain kind of evening, the kind that does not arrive all at once, but settles slowly. Like a blanket placed gently over the shoulders of a long day, Milford Junction knew that kind of evening well. And this one, after everything that had quietly unfolded, seemed to arrive with a little more care than usual. The sky softened into shades of rose and pale gold. The last light resting along the rooftops, not lingering, but not quite ready to leave either. The air had cooled just enough to be noticed, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and something almost like memory. Porch lights flickered on one by one, not out of necessity, but out of habit, and in windows across town, lamps were lit with the same quiet intention, not to brighten the night, but to welcome it. At the depot, the clock now moved as it always had, steady, reliable, each tick finding its place. No longer uncertain, no longer paused, and yet something of that pause remained, not in the clock itself, but in the way the town carried the day forward. People moved a little slower that evening, not out of tiredness, but because they had remembered something important. At the diner, chairs were stacked with care. Each one sat down with a small awareness. Mrs. Callahan wiped the counter in slow, thoughtful strokes. She paused once, looking out the window, the reflection of the soft evening light resting across the glass. "Good day," she said quietly, not to anyone in particular. And yet, it felt heard. Across the street, Mr. Dorsey walked home with his hands in his pockets. His steps unhurried, he passed the bench by the post office, glancing at it as he always did, but this time he paused. Just for a moment, he did not sit. He did not need to. He simply stood there, as if acknowledging something, and nodded once to himself, and continued on. At the library, Miss Clara closed the door softly behind the last visitor. The room settled into its familiar quiet, but it felt fuller now, not with sound, but with presence. She turned off the lights one by one, each click marking the gentle end of the day. And as she stepped outside, she looked back once. The building standing calm and steady, just as it always had at the edge of town. The train passed once more, its distant hum softer now, not calling attention, just reminding. The fields beyond the houses held the last of the light, stretching out in quiet stillness, and the trees stood as they always did, roots deep, branches patient, holding the day without question. In homes across Milford Junction, evenings unfolded in familiar ways. Dishes washed, chairs pulled closer, conversations shared in low voices. Not hurried, not filled with urgency. Just present, just enough. At the Harland house, the binoculars still rested by the window, untouched, not because they were forgotten, but because they were no longer needed. Mrs. Harland poured a cup of tea, setting it beside her husband. They sat together, not speaking much. Watching the light fade, there was nothing left to look for. And that, in its own way, was a kind of peace. The town clock continued its steady rhythm, tick by tick, minute by minute, not demanding attention, not asking to be noticed, but offering something else instead. Consistency, a quiet promise that things would continue, as they always had, as they always would. And as the night deepened, and the sky turned from soft blue to something darker, the stars began to appear, one at a time, not all at once, never all at once, just enough to remind you they were there. At the post office bench, a breeze stirred gently, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. The place where people had paused, where they had noticed, where they had simply been, now empty, but not quiet in the way emptiness usually is. It held something, a softness, a memory of presence, and across Milford Junction, there was a shared understanding, not spoken, not written, but felt, that the day had not been ordinary, even though, on the surface, nothing much had happened at all. And that is often the way of it. The days that stay with you are not the loud ones, not the ones filled with events and urgency, but the ones that pause, the ones that give you space, the ones that remind you that time is not something to chase, but something to sit beside for a little while before letting it move on. And so Milford Junction settled into the night, not with a sense of ending, but with a sense of continuation, because the truth of it was simple. This was not a story about something beginning, and it was not a story about something ending. It was a story about something being noticed, and once something is truly noticed, it does not disappear. It stays quietly, gently, becoming part of everything that comes after. And as the last light faded completely and the town slipped into sleep, there was one last feeling left behind, soft, steady, and certain that tomorrow would come. Not rushing, not demanding, but arriving just as gently. As today had, there is a moment just before sleep when the world feels both close and far away at the same time. The sounds soften, the edges of things blur, and whatever the day was, whatever it held, begins to settle, not disappear, not fade completely, but find its place. That is where this story comes to rest. not at an ending, but in that quiet space where everything gently continues. Milford Junction lay beneath a calm night sky, the kind that does not ask for attention, but offers it. The stars had settled into their places, scattered softly above the rooftops, and the town, with all its small moments, its quiet pauses, its unnoticed wonders, breathed slowly, as if it too had drifted into sleep. The clock at the depot continued its steady rhythm. Tick, 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 not loud, not insistent, just present, marking time without ever asking anyone to hurry. And in homes across the town, lights dimmed one by one, curtains drawn, doors closed softly, the day folding itself away, like a letter placed carefully into an envelope. At the Harland house, the window reflected the night sky now, the binoculars still resting where they had been left. A quiet reminder, not of something seen, but of something felt. Asterisk Mr. and Mrs. Harland had long since gone to bed, their house still, their breathing slow, and somewhere in the gentle quiet, the memory of that day remained, not as a question, but as a calm understanding, that not everything needs to be explained. At the library, the shelves stood silent, books waiting, stories resting inside them, each one ready, but in no hurry. Miss Clara's lamp had been turned off hours ago, and yet the space held a warmth, the kind that lingers even after the light is gone. At the diner, the chairs were stacked, the counters clean. The scent of coffee faded into the night, but the echoes of conversation, the soft laughter, they remained, not as sound, but as something gentler, something carried forward. Along Main Street, the breeze moved quietly between the buildings, not cold, not strong, just enough to remind the leaves to whisper. And the trees responded, soft rustles, small movements, the kind that feel like the world speaking. But only if you are listening. At the post office bench, no one sat. And yet, it did not feel empty. It had held something that day, a pause, a presence, and now it held the memory of it, the kind that does not fade, because it was never meant to be loud in the first place. The town clock continued, unbothered by the darkness, unconcerned with the passing hours, doing only what it had always done, keeping time, not for urgency, not for deadlines, but for continuity, for reassurance, for the simple truth that things move forward, even when they move slowly. And somewhere, in that quiet night, there was a feeling, one that could not be pointed to or explained in words, but could be felt, like the gentle weight of a blanket or the steady rhythm of breathing. A feeling that said, everything is as it should be. And if you had been there, walking slowly through Milford Junction in that hour, you might have noticed something. Not a sound, not a sight, but a sense that the town was not just resting. It was holding every small moment, every quiet pause, every unnoticed detail that had made the day what it was, and keeping it safe, not for remembering, but for being part of what comes next, because that is the way of things, not just in Milford Junction, but anywhere time is allowed to move gently. The days do not rush past, they gather, they settle. They stay with you in small ways, in the way you pause a little longer, in the way you notice a little more, in the way you sit without needing a reason. And as the night deepened further, and sleep found its way into every quiet corner, there was nothing left to do, nothing left to say, only this, a final gentle thought, that stories are not just told, they are shared, they are carried, they are given shape by the ones who listen. And tonight, this one found its place with you. So now, there is nothing left but rest. Let the world grow quiet. Let the thoughts slow down. Let the rhythm of the night carry you, just as it has carried this story in somewhere far off, in a small town that moves at its own pace. A clock continues to tick, soft, steady, unhurried, and that is more than enough. Well, now, that's enough for tonight. The day has said all it needed to say, and the night is ready to carry you the rest of the way. So settle in, get comfortable, and let sleep find you easy. Good night, my friend.